I know crimes. I can smell them. You don't have to smell this one. I can prove it to you 18 different ways. I can prove to you that he won Pennsylvania by 300,000 votes. I can prove to you that he won Michigan by probably 50,000 votes. When I went to bed on election night, he was ahead in all those states, every single one of those states. How is it they all turned around?
Called mail-in voting, and I know I'm going on a limb here because there's quite a lot to choose from. That was the most unhinged and bizarre press conference by a very sweaty Rudy Giuliani that I have seen. And again, in the pantheon of crazy, that is saying something, but I stand by that statement. Today, Rudy also rattled off all of the fraud that supposedly exists in this fantasy land. And so far, the Trump campaign's lawsuits are getting either thrown out of court, rejected, and we're talking about judges in multiple states and in multiple courthouses, obviously. It just dropped its lawsuit in Michigan that sought to block the certification of the results. That comes after two Republicans who had agreed to certify the results tried to rescind their decision, initially saying the Democrats had pressured them into going along. But one of those Republicans admitted to the Washington Post that she, in fact, got a phone call from the president himself. Now, Trump has invited Michigan Republicans to the White House. Why do you think? Of course, he's trying to do something, anything, to try to rig an election. Exactly. Right. He's trying to throw that state into his favor, even though they've already voted in a free and fair way and they voted for Biden. Let's go next door to Wisconsin. Joe Biden leads Trump by about 20,000 votes. And now the campaign has filed for a limited recount in just two counties that Biden won and won handily. It didn't spring for a full recount because that would have cost $8 million and they didn't want to spend the money. And next we go down to Georgia, where we're still waiting for the results of a hand recount. Going in, Biden held a 14,000 vote lead. To Pennsylvania, where Trump's attorneys, they've been dealt a series of setbacks. But now they claim that Trump won the state because 1.5 million ballots should never have been counted in the first place. Rudy personally tried the case in court on Tuesday, and to put it politely, it did not go well. He has been yelling about fraud for weeks now, but when he got before the judge, he said this.
Are you arguing then that strict scrutiny should apply here?
No, the normal scrutiny should apply. If we had alleged fraud, yes, but this is not a fraud case.
You heard him? Now all of a sudden this isn't fraud when he gets in front of a judge. Well, my next guest, he was in the court that day arguing against Rudy during that hearing. Mark Aronchick, he is counsel for Philadelphia, Allegheny, Montgomery, and Chester counties. Mark, it's been described as beyond surreal what it was like inside the courtroom. I thought that Rudy was arguing that there was massive fraud, but when pressed by the judge, he said that's not what our complaints about. Were even you confused what the argument that Giuliani was trying to make?
More than confused. I was dumbfounded. By the end, you're exactly right. The judge pressed Mr. Giuliani, and Mr. Giuliani said, essentially, notwithstanding that he talked all about fraud in the first 15 or 20 minutes of his presentation, that the case and the complaint that we were actually dealing with wasn't about fraud.
Listen, there's one thing for guys like me to talk on TV, but when you're in a court of law, you're supposed to present evidence and fact. Didn't Rudy go so far as to compare the people counting the votes to the mob and allege that in cities that you represented, like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, et cetera, that this was some giant cabal and that the remedy should be to disenfranchise basically everyone in Pennsylvania?
Richard, you put your finger right on it. In a federal courtroom, you go in and you argue what your complaint is about, you argue the law, you argue the facts. I don't think you go into a federal courtroom to repeat the kind of statements and speeches that he made at the Total Landscaping driveway the week before. And that's what I felt was going on. And then it just got to be at levels that were intolerable. Accusing patriots, great work, public servants, people who were trying to make the election work for all Americans, as being part of a mafia cabal, or at least some reference to a mafia cabal. And then even broadening the point that somehow there was this interstate kind of conspiracy with things happening in cities around the country. it just got to be too much. So I had two things I had to do. One was to just stop that kind of rhetoric, just oppose it. It's not fair to the clients I represent. It's not fair to the American public to even listen to. It doesn't belong in a courtroom. And then bring it all back to what this case was about, which was a complaint that was arguing that there was something wrong or improper about some part of the mail-in voting process, when I don't think there was. And whatever they were arguing about certainly didn't make out a federal case, and the case didn't belong in a federal courtroom. And I think I made the points pretty effectively.
It certainly seems that way from even the judge's perspective in the case. But, Mark, there's a consequence to this beyond just, the farce of it. I know that the former chief of staff to Trump, Mick Mulvaney, even said this isn't a reality TV show and that Rudy's not equipped. But Rudy went before the cameras today, and he's telling America that there's a pathway to the presidency for Trump and that this is all going according to plan, everything's falling into place. 70% of Republicans in this country believe the election was stolen from Trump in a recent Monmouth poll. I'm curious from your end, if the American public could have sat in that courtroom, do you think even the skeptics and the conspiracy theorists might have come to the conclusion that there's nothing there, that this is just smoke?
I think you would come to the conclusion that you would understand why we have such a great legal system, an independent judiciary that's the envy of the world. Because, it's one thing to go to parking lot driveways and stand on a soapbox. You have a First Amendment right to do that. But it's an entire other thing to go into an American courtroom, a federal district courtroom, or any American courtroom, and try to make that kind of rhetorical, sweeping, exaggerated kind of statements, because you're going to have to handle the questions from a federal judge who said quite clearly, Mr. Giuliani, how on the basis of two voters you're complaining about do I disenfranchise 680,000 legal voters in Pennsylvania? And Mr. Giuliani doubled down and said, well, I'm not just talking about 680,000. You might have to disenfranchise 1,200,000. And he didn't even answer the judge in any cogent way. And then the judge said, okay, fine. I'm reading this complaint that's in front of me. Where is it about fraud? And after hemming and hawing, he said, well, it's really not. It's about other things. And, what you said is, I couldn't even have said better. There is an erosion in confidence when these kinds of things happen, erosion in confidence about our legal system. And that is really unfortunate. That is probably one of the worst byproducts of what's going on, because it is a great system. And all across the country, judges have been handling these cases and largely throwing them out. And, if that's something that Mr. Giuliani doesn't want to see, okay, fine, but that's how the system works. And second, the other thing that's an unfortunate product of this, if you'll just let me say it again, is just the rhetoric that's being used against incredibly good public servants who want nothing more than to show the American people that democracy is working, that votes are being counted properly, that the elections are fine, they're being run fine, and they're being handled efficiently, and people have confidence, and should have it, in the outcome of those vote countings and this election. And those are people that can't speak for themselves. I have to speak for them. They are acting in a nonpartisan way. They put masks on in a pandemic. They went in as cases are spiking everywhere. They went in and they did their job and they did their duty. And sometimes they did it on 8-hour shifts, 24/7, overnight. And we need to understand who these people are. They're not a mafia cabal. They're not people in some gigantic, crazy conspiracy. They're Americans like you and I are. And they've done a laudable job for all of us. And I'm speaking in a nonpartisan basis. I'm speaking for them.
Mark Aronchick, I really appreciate a few minutes, and hopefully what we see in Pennsylvania, we're going to see in other contested states as well. I appreciate the time.
Thank you.
Up next, everyone, Are there cracks in Republican support for the president? That, as he continues to say, this election was stolen from him. After the break, ABC News political director Rick Klein, he'll join us to describe what's going on behind the scenes in D.C.